Picture this: a brand new country with an empty treasury, no navy and smugglers running wild along its coastline. And the man who fixed it wasn't a general or an admiral. He was a former immigrant orphan turned Treasury secretary, and his solution became the oldest continuously operating seagoing armed service in American history. Today, we're talking about August 4th, 1790, 236 years ago today, the day Alexander Hamilton helped create what we now call the United States Coast Guard. And here's the twist that surprises almost everyone. It wasn't born to fight wars. It was born to collect taxes. Let's set the scene. It's 1790. The United States is barely a year into its new constitutional government. George Washington is president. The ink on the Constitution is still practically fresh. The institutions of federal power are being invented in real time, and nobody quite knows yet whether this whole experiment is going to hold together. And the country is, frankly, broke. The Revolutionary War left the young nation drowning in debt, federal and state debts owed to soldiers, private creditors, and foreign allies who'd backed the fight for independence. That debt isn't some abstract ledger entry. Either it represents promises made to the very soldiers who won the war and the very allies who made victory possible. Somebody has to figure out how to pay all of that off, or the whole experiment in self-government might collapse before it even gets going. That job falls to Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury. And Hamilton, if you know anything about him, was obsessive about two things: building a strong federal government and making sure that government had the money to function. He's the guy who designed the National Bank, who argued for federal assumption of state debts, who basically invented American public finance from scratch. Financial architecture was, in a sense, his language. The way other founders thought in terms of armies or diplomacy, Hamilton thought in terms of credit, revenue, and solvency. And his plan to fund the government rested heavily on one thing: tariffs. Import duties, taxes collected on goods coming into American ports. Here's the problem. In 1790, the federal government didn't have much of anything to enforce those tariffs with. No Navy. Congress wouldn't authorize a new one until 1794. No Coast Guard, obviously, because this is literally the story of how it gets created. Just a handful of customs officials standing on docks, hoping merchants would honestly declare their cargo and pay what they owed. Imagine that for a moment. The entire enforcement mechanism for the nation's primary source of revenue amounted to trust and paperwork. And smugglers, they looked at that situation and saw an open door. Think about it from a smuggler's perspective. The coastline of the United States stretches for thousands of miles, full of inlets, coves, and harbors where a fast ship could slip in, unload untaxed goods, and vanish before any official even knew it happened. Every hidden cove was an opportunity, every foggy night a chance to slide past the few eyes watching the water. Rum, tea, molasses, textiles, all kinds of goods were being smuggled in specifically to dodge the new tariffs. And every gallon of rum that snuck past customs was money the federal government desperately needed and would never see. Hamilton understood something that a lot of people at the time didn't fully grasp. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. This was existential. If the government couldn't actually collect the revenue it was counting on, the whole financial system he was building, the debt repayment plan, the national credit, the very legitimacy of this new federal government, could come crashing down. A nation that can't collect its own taxes can't function. It can't pay its soldiers, honor its debts, or convince the world it's a government worth trusting. So Hamilton went to Congress with a proposal that, on paper, sounds almost too simple. Build a small fleet of fast, armed ships whose entire job is to patrol the coast, intercept smugglers, and make sure the tariffs actually got paid. And on August 4th, 1790, President Washington signed the law. It authorized what was originally described as a system of cutters and later became known as the Revenue Marine, and then the Revenue Cutter Service, a fleet of 10 cutters. Now, a cutter isn't a massive warship. These were small sailing vessels, prized for speed and maneuverability rather than firepower. Think of them less like a battleship and more like a highly capable Coast Guard patrol boat of their era, nimble enough to chase down a smuggler's ship into shallow coastal waters where a larger vessel couldn't follow. You can almost picture one of these cutters heeling into the wind, sails taut, cutting close to shore where a bulkier ship would run aground, closing the gap on a smuggler who thought the shallows would keep him safe. Here's a detail that really captures how lean this operation was. The entire construction budget for those 10 original cutters was capped at just $10,000. That's not $10,000 per ship. That's the total, split across the whole fleet. Hamilton wasn't building an imperial navy. He was building a scrappy, cost-effective tax enforcement fleet because that's exactly what the moment called for and exactly what the Treasury could afford. There's a kind of poetry in that. A founding father famous for wrestling the nation's finances into order, also making sure his own solution to smuggling didn't blow a hole in the very budget he was trying to balance. Now here's where the story gets genuinely remarkable, and it's the detail that makes this such a great piece of trivia. For the next 4 years, from 1790 until Congress reauthorized a navy in 1794, those 10 small revenue cutters were the only armed maritime service the United States government had. Not a backup fleet, not a secondary force alongside the Navy. The only one. The Continental Navy had vanished after the Revolution, and the first frigates of the newly authorized U.S. Navy wouldn't be launched until 1797 or put to sea until 1798, when rising tensions with France during what's known as the Quasi-War also pushed Congress to create a proper department of the Navy. So for much of that decade, if you wanted to picture the armed presence of the United States at sea, you wouldn't picture a big frigate with rows of cannons. You'd picture one of Hamilton's small cutters, sailing along the coast, enforcing tariff law, chasing smugglers, and, as it turned out, doing quite a bit more than that too. Because the service didn't just stop at tax collection. Revenue cutter crews aided vessels in distress and generally became the government's all-purpose presence on the water, decades before anyone used the phrase Coast Guard. In later years, they also enforced laws against the slave trade after Congress banned the importation of enslaved Africans. Whatever the water demanded of them, these small crews on small ships were expected to answer, stretching far beyond the narrow tax-collecting mission they'd started with. And that's really the heart of why this story is so fitting for Alexander Hamilton specifically. Most of the founding fathers we associate with military institutions are generals, Washington leading armies, or figures tied to naval glory and famous sea battles. Hamilton's contribution to America's maritime defense came from a completely different instinct. He wasn't thinking about glory or conquest. He was thinking about balance sheets. He looked at a leaky, under-enforced tariff system and treated it like the financial crisis it actually was. The revenue cutter service is, in a very real sense, a byproduct of Hamilton's obsession with making sure the government could pay its bills. It's peak Hamilton, practical, financially minded, and quietly foundational, in exactly the way his work on the National Bank and the assumption of state debts was foundational. No dramatic battle speeches, no grand strategic gambits, just a clear-eyed recognition that a government which can't collect what it's owed is a government that won't survive. So what happened to this scrappy little tax enforcement fleet? It didn't fade away, it evolved. The revenue cutter service kept growing and adapting for well over a century, taking on more and more responsibilities. Search and rescue, ice patrols, enforcing maritime law, protecting the coastline in wartime. Generation after generation, the mission kept broadening, always tethered back to that same original purpose of watching over American waters. Then, in 1915, Congress merged the Revenue Cutter Service with another agency, the U.S. Life-Saving Service, and gave the combined organization a new name, the United States Coast Guard. That merger is the direct institutional bridge between Hamilton's original tariff enforcement cutters and the Coast Guard that patrols American waters today, conducts search and rescue missions, and works maritime law enforcement. And because of that unbroken line, the Coast Guard doesn't count its birthday from 1915. It counts it from August 4th, 1790, the day Hamilton's fleet was authorized. That's not a technicality. It's how the Coast Guard officially traces its own history, which makes the Coast Guard, by its own reckoning, the oldest continuously operating seagoing armed service in the United States, older than the Navy as a continuously operating federal sea service. Born not from a battle plan, but from a Treasury Secretary's determination to collect the money owed to a fragile new nation. There's something wonderfully American about that origin story, honestly. It's not a tale of grand naval victories or dramatic wartime heroics. It's a story about infrastructure, about the unglamorous but absolutely essential work of making a government actually function, collecting revenue, enforcing the law, protecting a coastline nobody else was watching. 10 small ships, a shoestring budget, and one founding father's insistence that the numbers had to add up. That's how you get an institution that's still on the water, 236 years later, doing the job it was built to do. If you enjoyed uncovering this piece of American history, hit subscribe for more surprising stories from the nation's past, and drop a comment letting me know which founding father's story you want to hear next.